Hey there, Agile marmosets, and welcome to another episode of the Agile Bytes podcast, sponsored by Integrity Inspired Solutions, where we build software in an agile manner, day in and day out. Today, we're going to talk about velocity. What is it good for? And I have some thoughts on that. It's come up in several discussions on LinkedIn lately, and I would like to share them with you. Now, I'm going to say at the outset that this is mostly relevant to our Scrum practicing brothers and sisters. So if you're listening to this episode and you are not doing Scrum, this may not be as interesting to you. I hope you didn't drop off as soon as I said that. I think there's still value in this discussion. One is it helps you think about the larger landscape of the way we do Agile forecasting and planning. The other thing is many of you who are not doing Scrum enjoy making fun of people who are. And I would like to give you more ammunition for that. So stick around for that, and hopefully I can help you out there as well. Regardless of what framework or strategy or methods or practices or structure we are approaching our Agile projects with, there's a perennial question that it seems like we always have to answer, and that is, what can we get done by a certain time frame? This question is as old as Agile, or as old as project management, really. And, we like to think that when we're in an Agile environment and we're just regularly delivering value, that people will stop caring about that question. And I will say that if your teams are consistently and regularly delivering value, I would say that generally speaking, people are a lot less emotional about that question, but it never goes away. And in some respects, it really can't effectively go away. Marketing, for example, they have to plan their marketing campaigns. Sales has to know when they can start selling and certain things and when they can't start selling certain things. Other people need to make plans around our delivery rate. And so when we are in organizations like that, we find ourselves having to answer the question, what can we get done by a certain time frame? I do want to say that my favorite way to do this these days is Monte Carlo simulations and forecasts. And so I want to shout out to that. We have a podcast episode specifically on what Monte Carlo simulations are and an explanation of how to do them. I'm also happy to hop on Zoom with you, with your boss, with your team, with random people who are walking around in our parking lot right now on how to do Monte Carlo simulations. I will explain it to anybody, anytime. I talk about it at parties, and that's why I'm invited to so many parties. So I'm happy to show you how to do Monte Carlo simulations. If you find yourself in a position of having to make frequent forecasts, it is my favorite way to do it. There are other ways to do it, and today I want to talk about a very popular way around Scrum teams, and that is this concept of velocity. If you are using velocity, you probably already know what it is, I hope. But basically, velocity depends on story points. Story points are not part of Scrum. They are something that sort of ad hoc cropped up and became very popular in the community, probably because of some books by Mike Cohn. And the idea is that we have our user stories. They all have a story point value that is loosely indicative of the level of effort involved in producing those stories. And the way velocity works is you have a sprint, you have delivered some user stories, so you add up the story point values of those user stories, you get a total, and then that total sort of tells you some idea of how much you were able to get done that sprint. And then you can use that information as a basis for forecasting future sprints. So maybe you take an average of your velocities, or you take the average of the last 3 sprints velocities, or you just take the last sprint's velocity or whatever. And then when you're doing your sprint planning for your next sprint, you are using that story point total as a guide to how much you can actually take on. So for example, let's say this sprint, my team got several user stories done, and when you add up all the story points, we get 18 points. And as we look at previous sprints, we see, we kind of cycle between like maybe 17 and 20 story points in general per sprint. So when we're planning our next sprint, we kind of have in our heads, hey, we probably don't want to take on much more than, 17 to 18-ish story points in our sprint plan, because the story points we've been able to deliver up to this point, they kind of give us an idea. That's the idea behind velocities. And people have become so reliant on using velocity as a planning and forecasting tool that sometimes you end up in some rather strange and curious discussions, like, what if a user story only got half done this sprint? Should we split the story points up and count half of it toward the velocity for this sprint and the other half against the velocity for the sprint that we're going to plan? I will say that if you are routinely having discussions like that, something has not gone right with your Agile enterprise when you're trying to figure out like what percentage of this user story is done. Let me funnel that percentage of story points toward this sprint or that sprint. Things are not going well in terms of your planning and forecasting. Because the thing is, this method of planning and forecasting doesn't make a lot of sense. And I don't mean to say that it's one that I don't like. I don't mean to say it's one that has significant drawbacks. I don't mean to say even that out of all the ways there are to forecast, this one's kind of at the bottom of the list and there are 50 much, much better options. I don't just mean it's bad. I mean it literally does not make any sense. What you are doing, the activity, is intrinsically nonsensical. Let me sell you on this. Let's take a scenario where you're using story points as a relative size, or as I might call it, the right way to do story points. In other words, you have this body of user stories. You have a scale of story points, whether you use the Fibonacci sequence or just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It literally does not matter. But you got your scale of story points, and your smallest stories, they're going to be your ones. Your largest stories, those are going to be your, whatever the end of your scale is, 5 or 8 or 13 or whatever. And then the other stories are going to kind of fall out somewhere in between. Usually they loosely follow a bell curve distribution. So most of your stories are in the middle, your 3s and 5s and whatnot. And this is relative sizing because you're not saying the stories are going to take a specific amount of time. You're just grouping them by size, right? So your 1 group is all your smallest stuff. Your 2 group, that's the stuff that's bigger than your 1 stories, but they're not quite so big as you group them in with your 3 stories and so on and so forth, right? They're just group labels. And that's the problem. That's the problem. The numbers are just labels for size groups. They aren't any quantity of anything. They're a ranking system. They're a tier system. They are categories that are expressed as numbers. And that's what makes velocity nonsensical. Because if you are truly doing relative sizing, and if you are using story points, that's exactly what you want to be doing, then adding them together makes no sense. Let me give you an analogy. Let's say I had a list of 100 companies, and I decided to group them by revenue, and I had a scale of 1 to 5, or I used the Fibonacci sequence or whatever. So all my lowest revenue companies, those are all my 1s. All my super high, top of the scale, huge revenue companies, those were my 5s or my 8s or whatever. And then everyone else kind of shook out in between, and I grouped them together. I grouped them together by their relative revenue sizes. Now, is there a correlation between the points that I gave them and their revenues? Absolutely. The more revenues you've got, the higher your number's going to be. But is there a mathematical correlation between those numbers and the amount of revenue? There is not. I can't take 5 of my 1-point revenue companies, add their revenues together, and get an equivalent revenue to a 5-point revenue company. Or if I do, it's just sheer coincidence that that happened to work out that way. Because the numbers are just labels. You don't multiply them or add them together to yield any useful math. They are just a ranking system. So likewise, I can't take 5 of my 1-point stories and say, yes, this is an equivalent effort to one of my 5-point stories, because the points don't correspond to any underlying numerical quantity. So adding them together or comparing them against one another literally means nothing. It's literal nonsense. It's like if I look at the people who came in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd in a race, yeah, there's a correlation between what place they got and their race times, but I can't do calculations on those ranks and figure out something about their race times. Did the person who came in 2nd take twice as long as the person who came in 1st? Probably not. There's no mathematical correlation between those ranking numbers and then the underlying times. And it's the same for user stories. So if you're adding together your user point story totals and saying, yeah, this is basically reflective of 2 weeks worth of work, there is no connection, literally no correlation between those numbers and the times that you're actually looking at. And if there is, it's just because of sheer coincidence. It's not because there's actually a real correlation. And if you don't believe me, replace those story point category labels with something that's not a number. Use t-shirt sizes. Use progressively dangerous animals. Use colors of the rainbow. Use any other kind of rank labeling scale than numbers. Okay, just kind of do that in your head. Now, can you use velocity with the scale that you came up with? You can't add two smalls and that's going to equate immediately. You can't say, we got two smalls, a medium, and a large done this sprint, so we'll probably get two larges done next. There's no connection, right? You can't do that. Well, if you can't do that with non-numerical labels, then you can't do it with the numerical labels either. It's a trick. And in fact, I usually encourage teams not to use numerical story point values simply because they give you the illusion that they are quantities. It gives you the illusion that you can do math with those numbers and that math will mean something. But if they are truly relative sizes, if the numbers are just category groupings of similarly sized user stories, yeah, sure, there is a correlation between the points that you gave them and the time they'll probably take, but it's not a mathematical correlation. So adding them together tells you nothing. So let's take a different scenario. Let's take groups where the story points are proxies for a length of time. So SAFE does this, for example. SAFE recommends that your ones are stories that take half a day, and then you sort of scale up from there. Other teams may do this in a more or less sophisticated manner. All of our ones are half a day, all of our twos are a day, all of our threes are 2 days. There's some sort of point to hour scale or point to day scale. This is a pretty common thing. And even if people don't explicitly do it, they often do it in their heads. I ran into a team one time and they were showing me their backlog and the story points, and they actually had fractional story points. So this one was like 1.7 story points. This other story was like 0.8 of a story point or something like that. Obviously, they're equating story points with time to some degree or another, because if they were just using relative sizing categories, then it should be mathematically ludicrous to have like a 1.7 point story, right? Unless your relative sizing scale was so hyper fine grained that you had decimal categories in there. You're like running the Dewey Decimal System now of story points, I guess. But if someone has fractional story points, then obviously they're using story points as a proxy for time. And if you think this is uncommon, I would remind you that it was quite some time ago that our favorite tool, Jira, added the ability to put fractional story points into your estimates because this is so common. This is such a widespread thing that people are using story points for time. Now, some of you are listening to this and going, well, that's an abomination, right? Story points are not time. Story points are relative sizes. Well, again, I would remind you that if your story points are relative sizes, adding them together is meaningless. It tells you literally nothing about the underlying amounts of time. So if we're on the opposite end of that spectrum and story points are a proxy for time, then you might say, well, wouldn't velocity work in that place? Because at that point, we're basically doing capacity planning, right? If all of our ones are a half day and all of our twos are a day and our threes are 2 days and on, then when we're putting together the sprint plan, we can start adding up the times and we can start looking at how many days or hours our developers have available. And we can be like, yeah, if we generally have this amount of time available to work on user stories, then we just add up the times and are we kind of in the ballpark? Yeah, it works. But now my question is, why are you using story points at all? If they're just a proxy for time, just use the times. For Thor's sake, just use days and hours. Why did you create some additional translation layer between your hours and your story points? We had a podcast episode a while back where I brought this up and I said, what if I just invented falugals? And I reported all of my team's stories in falugal points. And someone asked what a falugal was. And I said, well, a falugal's half a day. So this story is 1 falugal, this story is 3 falugals, this story is 7 falugals. What am I doing with the falugals, man? Why don't I just say how many days it's going to take, right? Because that's actually what I'm talking about. I am really talking about hours and days. I am not really talking about story points. So why have the extra layer? Why have the charade? Just drop it. It's one of the biggest and most common examples of Agile in name only when people are like, well, we're Agile, so now we got to use story points. So let's take all the estimating that we were doing before and let's convert it into story points. Why are you doing that? That is an enormous waste of time. If you're going to estimate things in hours and days, then estimate things in hours and days. It's going to go way easier for everybody. Now, you're still going to be as wrong as you ever were, right? That was the whole issue with estimating in hours and days, is we're so often wrong, right? Well, you're not going to be any less wrong, but you're not going to be any less wrong if you convert those values to story points. You're still going to be as wrong as you ever were. So again, why go through the trouble, right? So in scenario 2, velocity actually does have meaning. The problem is you've created an artificial layer that you don't need. Just start doing hours and days, figure out how many hours and days you have available, try to make those numbers match up, and you will be just as wrong as you were before, but at least you'll be wrong in a much shorter amount of time. So if you've been with me through all this, then my answer to the question, velocity, what is it good for? The answer is absolutely nothing. If you are doing story points correctly, velocity tells you nothing mathematical about the amount of time things take. If you are using story points as a proxy for time, then you can do math on those story points and they will tell you how much you think you can get done. It's just, why are you using story points in that scenario? Just use days and hours, and then you're going to run into the same margins for errors that you've always run into. Converting them to story points does not make that margin for error go away. You're just doing something you don't need to do to look more agile at this point. Just get rid of it. Just use days and hours. But I would say that for both camps, whether you are relatively sizing and using velocity or your proxy for time and using velocity, I just don't think either of those are very good ways to forecast, to be totally honest with you. In fact, just counting the number of user stories you get done per sprint and using that is going to be just as effective as anything you're doing with velocity. And then if you want to move up beyond that, using Monte Carlo simulations, there's no reason you can't use Monte Carlo to help you plan sprints. But as we're talking about forecasting, especially for my Scrum brothers and sisters, I do want to remind you that the way Scrum is supposed to work when you plan your sprints is you have a sprint goal, and then you select the smallest amount of stories you can that will accomplish the sprint goal. And then if you get done early, great, you can always pull more stuff into the backlog. Remember, in Scrum, the team does not commit to a sprint backlog. They commit to a sprint goal. So you pick your goal, you pick the smallest amount of work that will meet that goal. This problem will probably take care of itself. 9 times out of 10, you'll get done early in your sprint. You'll accomplish your sprint goal because you picked the bare minimum things you can do. And now you're in the position to decide if you have enough time to take on additional work, to add enhancements to that sprint goal, features that weren't as essential, or get a head start on something else, or get some bug fixes done, or do whatever it is you want to do. But just keep that in mind. The point of sprint planning is not to fill your sprint to maximum capacity. The point of sprint planning is to figure out what you need to do to hit that sprint goal, and is that viable to do in one sprint? And if the answer is yes, then I don't know how much velocity is going to help you anyway. I think you'll find that the problem will just kind of take care of itself if you just focus on that, committing to that sprint goal, and then the smallest amount of work you can do to meet that sprint goal. Will this work fit into a sprint or not? That's really all you need to care about. The numbers that you come up with story point totals and whatever never really mattered anyway if you were focused on the sprint goal. So I hope this helps. I encourage you not to use story point velocity to do forecasting because it is literally meaningless. It is literally self-contradictory. If you have heard some things in today's podcast and you want to know more, please reach out to me. Hop onto our website, fill out a contact form, find me on LinkedIn, ping me there, send me an email if you got my email address, and I'll be happy to walk you through some alternatives. I hope this discussion is helpful. If you are using velocity, start thinking about some good alternatives. Thanks everyone for listening to Agile Bites. Agile does sometimes bite, but we don't think it always has to. If you enjoyed what you heard today, don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you happen to be using. And if you can, leave us a comment because we'd love to hear your feedback. What things would you like to hear about? What things did you hear that were valuable to you today? You can also head over to integrityinspired.com to sign up to our email list. But that's all for today, folks. We'll see you next time.